There is a specific kind of silence that fills a room when someone says the wrong thing, or rather, the right thing to the wrong person. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She wasn't even thinking about him. Or at least that's what she told herself every morning when she walked through those glass doors and sat down at the desk outside his office. She had a system, a very functional, very intentional system that involved professional distance and the strategic deployment of humor whenever things got too close to feeling real. She was just asking a simple question, getting dressed up, stepping into a night she had planned entirely for herself, and asking the one man she absolutely should not have asked. "Do you think I look good? I have a date tonight." What happened next changed everything. Not because of what he said, but because of what he couldn't say. Not because one question broke something open, but because it revealed that something had already been broken open. Quietly, gradually, over the course of 18 months of shared mornings and unspoken observations and a careful, excruciating tenderness that neither of them had named. This is a story about a man who controlled entire markets but could not control the way he looked at her, and a woman who had spent her whole life keeping people at a safe, comfortable, laughable distance, until the one person she most needed to keep away refused to stay there. Stay with us. This one is going to get under your skin. If you're new here, welcome to the Wisdom Series. Subscribe so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below. Have you ever used humor to hide something real? We would love to hear from you. The story begins in the spring of 2022, on a Monday that felt, as most Mondays in Manhattan do, like a punishment for having enjoyed the weekend. Arabella Flynn was 27 years old, and she was running exactly 4 minutes late, which was unusual for her, because Arabella Flynn was never late. She didn't allow herself to be. Lateness was a crack in the armor, and Arabella's armor was immaculate, built over years, fitted carefully, and maintained with the kind of discipline that looks like ease from the outside. She had come to New York 3 years earlier from Baltimore, with a communications degree, a suitcase, and the specific kind of determination that only people who grew up watching their mothers work 2 jobs tend to have. She wasn't chasing a dream, exactly. She was chasing stability, something solid under her feet. She'd had enough of floors that shifted, enough of mornings where the quality of the day depended on variables she couldn't predict or control. She had decided, at some point in her adolescence, that she would build a life she controlled, a life where she knew all the variables. She had, on the whole, succeeded. She had good work, and a good apartment, and a good friend and a mother she called every Sunday. She was fine. She used that word a lot. Actually, fine. She had learned very early that fine was a full stop, a conversation ender, a door politely but firmly closed. Nobody pushed past fine. The job at Bay Capital had come through a recruiter she'd worked with twice before. The listing was straightforward. Executive assistant to the CEO, high pressure, high expectations, competitive compensation. The recruiter had added, in a hushed voice over the phone, that the previous 2 assistants had left within 6 months each. One citing the hours, the other citing simply that Mr. Bay was difficult. Arabella had asked what difficult meant. The recruiter had paused just a half second too long. That, Arabella had decided, was enough information. She took the job. Woo Rim Bay was 34 years old when they first met. The founder and CEO of a private equity firm that managed assets most people couldn't conceptualize without sitting down first. He had built Bay Capital from a small fund at 26 with 3 investors and a borrowed conference room in Midtown, and by the time Arabella walked through the doors on that Monday in April, the firm occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower on Park Avenue. He had not gotten there by luck, or by inheritance, or by the kind of fortunate accident that sometimes produces success. He had gotten there by being, in the specific way that very few people are, genuinely exceptional at understanding the logic beneath things. He was, by all measurable standards, exceptional in a way that had nothing to do with spectacle. The kind of man who made a room recalibrate the moment he entered it, not through noise, not through charm deployed like a weapon, but through stillness. Woo Rim Bay was very, very still. He spoke in complete sentences and never repeated himself. He listened in a way that made people feel observed rather than heard, which some people found disconcerting, and which Arabella, when she encountered it for the first time, found interesting. The first thing he said to her during her interview was, "Tell me about the last time you made a significant mistake." Most candidates would have prepared a careful, redemptive answer, something polished. Arabella looked at him for a moment and then said, without blinking, that she'd once triple-booked her previous boss for the same afternoon, which resulted in him having to cancel a lunch with a city council member, miss his daughter's recital, and eat a granola bar alone in a parking garage. She'd spent the next week learning calendar management software that most assistants didn't bother with, and the following month she'd built a redundant scheduling system that her former employer still used 2 years later. Woo-Rim had looked at her for 3 full seconds before writing something in his notebook. He'd called the recruiter that evening. Arabella started the following Monday. The first 3 months were exactly what the recruiter had warned her about. The hours were long. The standards were exacting. Woo-Rim did not do small talk. He did not soften requests with pleasantries. He didn't say, "Good morning," in the traditional sense. He said it the way a person might confirm a weather report, noting the day had begun, and considering that sufficient. But he was not unkind. That was the thing that the previous assistants had perhaps missed, or perhaps couldn't access because they'd been too busy being offended. Woo-Rim wasn't difficult because he was cruel. He was difficult because he was precise, and precision, in a world of approximations, tends to feel like coldness to people who are used to warmth as the default setting. He did not perform warmth. He didn't have patience for performances of any kind. He found them inefficient. Arabella was precise too, different in every visible way, warmer, louder, quicker to laugh. But underneath all of that, she kept her world in very careful order. She had to. It was the only way she'd survived the uncertainty of growing up in a house where love was present but stability was not. She knew how to work hard, and she knew how to be charming, and she knew how to make people feel at ease in rooms that might otherwise feel tense. So they worked. And they worked well, in the particular way that 2 instruments in different registers can make music together, each distinct, each indispensable, each contributing something the other couldn't. By the time she'd been there a year, Arabella had become the person the whole office ran through. Not officially. Officially, she was the CEO's executive assistant. But practically. She knew the cadences of the floor, the egos and alliances, the unwritten protocols. She knew which analysts needed encouragement and which ones needed to be trusted to work alone. She knew that the coffee machine on the 42nd floor ran 12 minutes slower than the one on the 41st. She knew that Woo-Rim ate lunch at his desk more often than he should, and that if he missed it entirely, the afternoon would be crisp in a way that was best avoided. She had decoded him in the way that only people who pay very close attention can. She knew things he had never told her. She'd simply noticed, and the strange, uncomfortable truth that she would not have admitted to anyone, not to her best friend Camille, not to her mother, not to the journal she kept on her nightstand, was that she noticed because she wanted to, not as a professional cataloging her employer's patterns, but as a woman who had started, somewhere around month 14, to look forward to the particular way he said her name when he walked out of his office and needed her immediately. It was 2 syllables. That was all. Arabella. But he said it like it was a complete sentence. And she had spent more time than was appropriate thinking about what kind of sentence it was. She chose, consistently and deliberately, to find this funny. She turned it into a joke, to herself, about herself, because that was what Arabella Flynn did. She turned the things that scared her into punchlines before they could turn into anything else, before they could turn into want, before they could turn into risk. She was very good at it. She had been doing it for years. She would eventually understand, the thing that had kept her from a lot of pain, and also from a lot of living. It was a Thursday in October 2023. Arabella was 28. She had been at Bay Capital for a year and a half. She had a dinner that evening. Not a real dinner. Or rather, It had started as a real dinner, in the sense that someone had asked her, and she had agreed. A friend of a friend. Someone Camille had been insisting she meet for 3 months with the specific relentlessness that Camille applied to all endeavors she considered important. A man named Marcus who worked in architecture and had, according to Camille, a very good jaw and a very easy laugh. Camille had sent 3 photos as evidence. The jaw was, objectively, good. Arabella had agreed to the dinner mostly to get Camille to stop texting her about it, which was not, she acknowledged privately, a great reason to agree to dinner with a person. But she had been saying no to things for long enough that Camille had started using a different voice, the quiet one, not the enthusiastic one, and the quiet voice was harder to deflect. She'd worn something she hadn't worn in a while, a deep plum-wrap dress that she normally saved for occasions that never materialized. And she'd come straight from work, which meant she'd changed in the office bathroom and done her makeup at her desk with the particular efficiency of someone who has mastered the art of beauty routines in 12 minutes or less. At 6:45, with 15 minutes to go before she needed to leave, she stepped into the doorframe of his office. This was standard. She did it at the end of most days. A brief check-in, confirmations, next day priorities. It had become one of the reliable rhythms of her day, which was itself information she had filed carefully under Do Not Examine. Woo Rim was at his desk, reviewing a document. He didn't look up immediately, which was normal. She waited, which was also normal. He finished the paragraph he was reading and looked up, and then he went very still, which was, in fact, not normal. He was always still. But this was a different quality of stillness, the kind that a person holds when they are preventing themselves from doing something. And I'm heading out. Then, with the ease of someone who has made an art form out of casual, the way she asked questions to fill silences she was afraid of, the way she'd been asking things her whole life to keep the conversational surface moving. Do I look okay? I have a date tonight. The room did something strange. The air in it shifted, the way it does before a storm. Not a visible change, not anything she could point to later and say, there, that was the moment. Just a quality of attention that was suddenly different. Intensified. Like the moment when you realize something is watching you, and you realize you have been aware of it for much longer than you admitted. You look fine. Flat. The most evacuated word in the language. It was 3 words. But, you look, was just grammar. The word that counted was fine. Fine. The most emptied-out word in the English language. The word that means nothing. The word that people use when they are working very hard to use no word at all. The word that Arabella herself used as armor. She knew what fine sounded like when someone meant it. This was not that. Fine, she repeated. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. Something at the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more private. Okay, don't wait up. She picked up her bag from her desk and walked to the elevator. In the elevator, she pressed the lobby button and looked at her reflection in the polished steel doors. The woman looking back at her was wearing a dress she'd been saving for no reason. She looked, objectively, better than fine. Something inside her was quiet in a way that was either very settled or very unsettled. She stood in the elevator and felt it, for once, without converting it immediately into a joke. Across the floor, behind the closed door of his office, Woo Rim Bae set his pen down on the desk and looked at the document in front of him. He read the same sentence 4 times. It stopped making sense after the second. He stood, walked to his window, and looked at the city that he had always been able to read like a balance sheet. A system, a set of inputs and outputs that responded to logic and patience and careful analysis. Tonight it told him nothing useful. He had known, in an abstract way, that she had a personal life. Of course she did. She was 28 years old and warm and sharp and the kind of person who filled rooms without noticing she was doing it. There had always been a part of her that was entirely not his, entirely her own, entirely outside the scope of anything professional. He had always respected that boundary. What he had not known, what he had apparently not permitted himself to know, was how much he didn't want there to be dinners, how much "fine" had been the last word he trusted himself with. He picked his pen back up and made himself read the document. He got through 3 more pages before he stopped pretending. The dinner with Marcus was fine. She would use that word later without irony. The jaw was as advertised. The laugh was easy and genuine. He talked about a project in Brooklyn he was proud of, a community art space that had taken 3 years to fund and 6 months to build, and which he described with the particular glow of someone who understands that the best work is the kind that outlasts you. He asked thoughtful questions. He insisted on splitting the check in a way that felt practiced but sincere. Arabella smiled and asked follow-up questions and was, by any external measure, a lovely dinner companion. Warm, present, attentive. She was also, internally, somewhere else entirely. She was in a glass tower on Park Avenue, turning over a single word in the part of her mind that she usually kept very quiet. The next morning, she stopped by Camille's apartment before work. Camille was her oldest friend. They'd grown up 3 blocks apart in Baltimore, had survived each other's worst phases, including the phase where Arabella had briefly convinced herself she didn't need anyone, and had spent 6 months being politely but completely unreachable. Camille had waited her out, which was the thing about Camille. She did not rattle easily. Arabella described the interaction in the office, verbatim. She was good with words and better with details, and she laid it out the way you lay out evidence, each piece in order. Camille listened without interrupting, which took effort. When Arabella finished, Camille set down her coffee cup. Then she said, with the particular patience of a woman who had been waiting 2 years to have this conversation, "Bella, he's jealous. He's my boss. Jealous bosses exist. They are not a theoretical category." It was one word. Fine, that's not jealousy, that's monosyllabism. It's the monosyllabism of a man who didn't trust himself to say more than one word. There's a difference. Camille picked her coffee back up. How did he look when he said it? Arabella was quiet for a moment. Exactly, Camille said. I'm not having this conversation. You are literally having this conversation. You came here at 7:30 in the morning, on a Friday. Arabella looked at her. Then she looked at her coffee. I need to get to work, and left. But she thought about it. She thought about it on the subway and walking the 4 blocks to the office and while she was sorting through the morning's correspondence. She thought about it the way you think about something you've been pretending not to think about, all at once, with the accumulated weight of all the time you spent not thinking about it. And then, 3 days later, on a Tuesday, she discovered something she hadn't been looking for. It came through Jonas, the office manager, who mentioned in passing while they were waiting for the elevator that he'd been surprised when Daniel Park had transferred to the Singapore office last spring. A good analyst, Jonas said, seemed genuinely happy here. The decision had come down fast, faster than those things usually moved. Arabella had worked with Daniel briefly on a project coordination in the winter. He'd been easy to work with, organized, friendly, one of those people who is quietly competent without making a performance of it. He'd also, she now recalled with sudden and specific clarity, sent her an email last February. She'd seen the subject line, something casual, asking if she'd want to grab coffee sometime, not work coffee, the other kind. She'd been about to reply when the email had simply disappeared from her inbox. She'd assumed she'd accidentally deleted it in the blur of a busy morning. She'd thought about asking him about it, then hadn't, because the moment had passed and she had let it, the way she let most things that could become complicated. Who authorized the transfer? She asked Jonas, keeping her voice entirely conversational. Curious, nothing more. Jonas looked vaguely uncertain. Transfers at that level go through Mr. Bay, standard process. Right, Arabella said. Of course. She pressed the elevator button again, even though the light was already lit. She stood in the elevator and she added things up. The email that had vanished, Daniel, gone to Singapore within weeks. The word, fine, with all the air let out of it. The way Wu Rim sometimes paused in the middle of delegating a task when she laughed at something across the room, a pause so brief it barely existed, but which she had catalogued without consciously deciding to. She had filed all of these things under Do Not Examine. She had been very disciplined about that particular filing system. She walked back to her desk and sat down. She stared at the calendar on her screen without seeing it. Then, very slowly, a smile crossed her face. Not a happy smile exactly. The kind of smile that arrives when you realize you have a great deal more information than you've been letting on. Even, and especially, to yourself. She had a decision to make. She could let this stay filed. She was good at that. She had 28 years of practice. Or she could pull the file and see what was in it. A week passed. She said nothing. She behaved exactly as she always had. Efficient, warm, precise, occasionally hilarious at the expense of the quarterly reports. She brought him his 2:00 call notes with the same composure she'd always had. She fielded his scheduling conflicts with the same organized calm. She laughed at things that were funny and did not perform laughter at things that weren't, which was one of the qualities he had relied on about her from the beginning. But she watched. More carefully now, because she knew what she was watching for. What she saw, once she stopped filtering it, was a lot. It was in the small things, as it always is. The way he tracked her across the room when he thought she wasn't looking. Not blatantly, not stupidly, but with the specific quiet attention of someone who has been keeping track of something for a long time. The way attention moved through his jaw whenever another person in the office made her laugh loudly. The parking permit, which she now understood differently. He'd had it arranged for her the week after she'd mentioned, once, in passing, that walking from the street in the rain was getting old. He had not mentioned it. He had just made it happen. He had been paying attention to her in exactly the way she had been paying attention to him. Two people in a room, both watching, neither speaking. She found this both moving and maddening in equal measure. On a Wednesday in November, 3 weeks after the dinner, 2 weeks after the conversation with Camille, 1 week after she'd connected the dots, Arabella wore the dress again. The same plum-wrap dress, same earrings, same heels. She spent approximately 45 seconds deciding whether to do it, and the rest of the morning being very calm about having decided. She waited until he was deep in a document review, which was when he was at his most focused, and therefore most likely to react before he could organize the reaction. She appeared in the doorframe of his office at exactly 6:15, just as the floor was thinning out. He looked up. She watched his expression move through 3 things in approximately 1 second. I'm heading out early today. I wanted to confirm the Singapore call is still set for tomorrow at 8. She had already confirmed it twice. It's confirmed. Level, professional. Perfect. She didn't move. She reached up and adjusted an earring. A small, unhurried gesture that she'd practiced until it looked unconsidered. Do I look okay? I have plans. The pause was nearly imperceptible. A fraction of a second. It would have meant nothing to anyone who hadn't spent 18 months learning this man's rhythms. To Arabella, it was very loud. Yes. Careful. Like a man reading from a script he'd assembled while she was still standing there. Good. She picked up her bag. Good night, Mr. Bay. She left. 3 blocks away, she bought a coffee she didn't need, sat on a bench in a small midtown plaza, and looked at the sky going dark between the buildings. She had wanted proof. She had wanted to feel like the one with information rather than the one being managed. She had gotten what she wanted. Instead of feeling powerful, she felt undone. Because the question she'd been asking him, for the second time now, dressed in the same dress, was not entirely a test. The test was what she'd told herself, but the question underneath the question was real. Did he see her? Not the efficient, unshakable, always fine version she maintained every day in that office. The actual her. The one who kept people at distance because she had learned early and well that being seen fully and then left was worse than never being seen at all. The one who was funny because the alternative was being scared. The one who wore a dress she'd been saving and asked a man if she looked okay, and meant, "Do I matter to you?" She drank her coffee in the cold air and felt the full weight of what she'd been avoiding for a year and a half. She was not performing the question anymore. She had performed it tonight. Yes. But she had meant it. She called in on Monday morning at 7:58, 2 minutes before her shift, and told the office administrator that she would be taking a few days of personal leave. She had the time accrued. She would be available by email for anything urgent. She spent those 3 days in her apartment. She wasn't sick. She was, for perhaps the first time in a long time, being honest with herself about something difficult, and that required a particular kind of quiet. Arabella had learned early that the most dangerous thing she could do was want something she wasn't sure she could have, not because wanting was dangerous in itself, but because she felt things completely. She didn't half want things. She didn't have casual feelings about important things. She went all in, always, and then had to carefully and painfully dismantle that investment when it didn't work out. She'd learned to start the dismantling early, before the want was fully formed. It was more efficient. It hurt less. The problem was that she had been trying to dismantle this one for 18 months and it hadn't worked. She read. She cooked. She reorganized her bookshelf, which was what she did when she was thinking through something serious. On the second day, she called her mother in Baltimore, who picked up on the first ring and said nothing about the fact that it was a Tuesday at noon, and Arabella never called on weekdays. Her mother listened. She had always been a listener. She said, eventually, "You sound like you're working something out." Arabella said she was fine. Her mother said, which contained an entire separate conversation. "I might have let something get complicated," Arabella said, "at work." Complicated how? The feeling kind. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not complicated, baby. That's just scary." Arabella reorganized the bottom shelf of her bookcase. There's a difference. All the difference in the world. At Bay Capital, the 3 days did something. The first day, Woo Rim worked the way he always worked. Fully, without visible distraction. He was a person who worked the way other people breathed, and he had years of practice at making his interior life invisible. The second day, things started to show. He answered emails faster than usual, which meant he was filling time rather than focusing. He stood at his window twice for longer than the view required. He walked to the kitchen, which he almost never did, and stood in front of the coffee machine without making coffee. The third day, he called Jonas into his office and asked whether Mrs. Flynn had indicated when she expected to return. Jonas said the email had said a few days. Woo Rim nodded. He looked at something on his desk as though it had information about her. "Thank you." Jonas left. Woo Rim stayed at his desk until 8:30 that evening, going through material he had already reviewed, because going home meant going somewhere with no particular reason to be, and that had become, over the past 3 days, an acutely uncomfortable destination. He was not a person who spent time examining his own interior, not because he was incapable of it, but because it had always seemed an inefficient use of time. The interior was what it was. You worked with it. You didn't interrogate it. What was happening now, in the absence of her particular presence, was that the interior was interrogating him. It was doing so in the language of an empty desk and a quiet floor, and the specific absence of a laugh that he had apparently come to rely on more than he had realized. He had spent a great deal of his adult life organizing everything. His work, his schedule, his expectations. He had built a world that ran the way he understood things should run, with precision and intention, and the exclusion of variables he couldn't account for. She had become a variable he couldn't account for. He had been trying to account for her for a year and a half. On the third night, he got into his car at 8:45 and told his driver an address that was not his apartment. Arabella was in her kitchen at 9:15 on a Wednesday night, attempting to make her grandmother's jollof rice from memory because she wanted comfort, and her grandmother was 3 states away, and her memory was good, but not perfect. The rice was doing something questionable. She had added tomato paste at a moment that her grandmother would probably have characterized as premature. When the knock came at her door, she stood still for a moment. Camille always texted. Her building had a doorman and a buzzer, which meant whoever was on the other side of this door had gotten through both. She wiped her hands on a dish towel. She opened the door. Woo Rim stood in the hallway. He was in a suit that was no longer quite as immaculate as it had been that morning. The jacket still on, the tie slightly loosened, a quality of lateness to him that she had never seen before. He had the look of a man who had made a decision and was now standing inside the consequences of it, not yet sure how the math was going to land. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Mr. Bay, not cold, not warm, careful. You weren't at work. He said it the way he said most things, as though the context was self-evident and further explanation would be redundant. I know. I took personal leave. I'm entitled to it. I'm aware. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely. Not defensive, just steady. The way she stood when she was thinking. So why are you at my apartment at 9:15 on a Wednesday? He looked at her. The pause before he answered was not his usual collected pause. This was a person finding words they hadn't prepared. I wanted to know you were all right. I'm fine. She said it with a small, deliberate echo of the word he'd given her, just enough weight to be noticed. He caught it. Something moved through his expression. Acknowledgement, maybe, or the beginning of it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, "May I come in?" She should have said no. There was a whole version of this story where she said no, and closed the door and went back to her imperfect rice and her careful distances. She had spent 28 years being very good at that version. She knew all the lines. She stepped back and opened the door wider. He came in. He looked at the apartment, the pot on the stove, the cutting board still out, the books arranged in a way that made it clear she used them rather than displayed them. The framed photograph of her mother at 25 on the shelf, younger than Arabella was now, smiling at something off camera. You cook. A quiet observation. I try to. She moved back toward the kitchen, needing something to do with her hands. My grandmother's recipe, approximately. I've made a few questionable decisions with the tomato paste. He stood in the living room. He didn't sit. He looked like a man who had arrived at the right place and was still working out the right entrance. You wore the same dress. She went still. Her back was to him. She turned slowly from the stove and looked at him. Both times. The same dress. 3 weeks apart. After your conversation with Jonas about Daniel Park. The air in the apartment changed. She set the spoon down on the counter. Her heartbeat was doing something she'd prefer it not to. How do you know I talked to Jonas about Daniel? Jonas mentioned it. No particular intention. Just in passing. The way Jonas mentions things. She was quiet. The transfer was mine. It was a legitimate business decision. Daniel was the strongest available candidate for the Singapore role. That part is true. And the email? A silence that answered before he did. There was an IT issue that quarter. Woorim. She had not used his first name before. Not once in 18 months. Not in conversation. Not even in her own head. She had been careful about that too. It came out differently than she'd expected. Quieter. Like setting something down that had been getting heavier. He looked at her. Was it really an IT issue? The silence that followed was the most honest answer he'd given her all evening. She moved out of the kitchen. She crossed the room and stood closer to him than was easy for either of them. You had no right to do that. That was my life. My decision to make. I know. I'm your employee. You intervened in something personal without asking me and without telling me, and I didn't even know it happened. I know. He didn't qualify it, didn't build a defense, just stood inside it. And you said fine. Her voice was quieter now. The anger was real, but something else was underneath it, larger and more complicated. I came to ask you something, and you gave me a word that means nothing. Because I didn't trust myself with more than one word. He said it plainly. No artifice. And I'm aware that is not an adequate explanation. It's just the true one. She looked at him. She let herself look at him fully, which she had been careful not to do for a long time. He looked back. I'm sorry. What I did with Daniel, it was wrong. I acted on something I hadn't admitted to myself, and I made a decision that wasn't mine to make. That won't happen again. She hadn't expected the apology to be that clean. No architecture around it. No conditional. Just the thing itself. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you just say something? Because you laugh. He said it the way you say a thing you've been carrying. You use it the way I use silence. As distance. And I didn't know how to get through it without breaking something you'd built on purpose. The back of her throat went tight. I wasn't sure that you wanted me to. She stood in the middle of her living room and felt the things she had been keeping in motion. The jokes, the distance, the careful management of her own wanting. Go very still. Woo-rim. She looked at him. I wore the same dress on purpose. I asked the same question on purpose. Both times. Something changed in the quality of his attention. I wanted to see what you'd do. He understood. She watched him understand, and quiet. You drove to my apartment at 9:15 on a Wednesday. He crossed the room. She didn't move. He stopped close enough that the distance between them was a decision, not a default. He said her name. Arabella. The two syllables she had heard thousands of times. Except this time something in the way he said it was different. Like a door opening from the inside. I don't know how to do this well. Quiet. Like something he'd been carrying a long time. I have spent a significant portion of my adult life arranging things so that I control the outcome. You are the only thing in my professional life that has consistently defied that arrangement. And I have... A brief pause. And I have found that I have stopped wanting to correct it. She almost laughed. The laugh came out broken. Less like armor and more like relief. He kissed her. No announcement. No further qualification, just the decision, made and executed, which was entirely consistent with who he was. She kissed him back, which was entirely consistent with who she was, even if she had spent 18 months arguing otherwise. The rice burned. Neither of them noticed for quite a while. Here is what happened next, and it matters to tell it carefully, because this is not a story about two people who had one big moment and then lived simply ever after. That kind of story is easier to tell, and it is not this one. They talked until nearly 2 a.m, about practical things. First, because they were both, fundamentally, practical people. The reporting structure would need to change. They agreed on that immediately and without drama, which was itself a small indication that they were going to be all right. Neither of them was willing to compromise professional integrity for personal feeling, and the fact that they both knew that about each other was one of the first things that felt like solid ground. Then they talked about the harder things, about what had been true and when, about Daniel, and what it had felt like for her to discover it. He listened without defending himself, which cost him something, she could tell, and which she respected accordingly. She talked about her armor, the humor, the distance, the fine, and he listened to that too, with the particular attention he gave everything, except this time it wasn't professional. She asked when it had started. He was quiet for a moment. There was a day in the first year. A merger review. You'd been there about 6 months. You found an error in the financial model that my analysis team had missed. You didn't make an announcement. You left a note on my desk. She remembered. She'd spent an hour deciding whether to bring it up directly or leave it for him to find. She'd chosen the note because she'd wanted him to encounter it without her standing there, because she hadn't been sure of the protocol, and she hadn't wanted to seem like she was overstepping. The note said, Page 44. Check the depreciation table. Signed, Arabella, as if I wouldn't know who else would have left it. Something moved through his expression. I read it and thought, this person is going to be a problem. She stared at him. A problem? The unanticipated kind. She laughed. The real one. The one that came from somewhere she kept very well protected. I've never done this. The quiet had settled back in. This specific thing. Letting someone in without a safety net. Neither have I. Is that supposed to be reassuring? Probably both reassuring and alarming. A beat. I would estimate about 60-40. She looked at him in the low light of her apartment. You're funnier than you let people know. I only have occasion to be funny around specific people. She held that. She let it land without dismantling it. In the weeks that followed, careful weeks, deliberate weeks, weeks of restructured reporting and quiet honesty, and learning to be in the same space differently, Arabella found herself doing something unfamiliar. Letting herself be known. Not performing ease. Not being warm in the strategic way that managed distance while appearing to close it. Actually letting someone see the parts she'd been protecting. It happened slowly, in ordinary moments. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He didn't ask about it. He just left a coffee on her desk on the days she came in looking like sleep had been a negotiation, and the coffee was always right. Her exact order. She had never told him. He had observed it and retained it and acted on it, and he had been doing that quietly for longer than she'd known. She asked once, lightly, "How long have you known how I take my coffee?" Without looking up. 2nd week. She stood there. The 2nd week. You ordered twice in front of me in the 1st week. You always modify the same things in the same order. It wasn't difficult to learn. You're a little terrifying, you know that. He looked up. You already knew that. Yes, but you weren't supposed to know that I knew. She went back to her desk and sat down, and felt something shift in her chest that she hadn't known was still braced. The coffee was not a grand gesture. That was the point. It was 17 weeks of quiet, unglamorous, entirely uncredited attention. It was the 2nd week. She cried about it privately, on a Thursday morning in her bathroom before work. Not sad crying. The other kind. The kind that comes when something you'd stopped expecting shows up and behaves like it was always going to. She called her mother that evening. She said, "I think I'm in it. I think I actually let someone in, and I don't know how to not be terrified." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "The terrified means it's real, baby. That's not a warning sign. That's just what it feels like when you stop running." Arabella sat on the edge of her bed and thought about running. About how good she'd been at it. About all the things she'd almost had and had moved away from before they could move away from her. Then she thought about a man who'd come to her apartment at 9:15 on a Wednesday night with no plan and a slightly loosened tie, because she hadn't been at her desk. She thought about the second week. She stopped running. Woo Rim had grown up in a household that prized competence above sentiment and results above process. He had been taught, by example rather than instruction, that emotion was a resource, useful when deployed correctly, expensive when wasted. He had taken that lesson seriously. He had built a life and a company, and an entire interior architecture around it. The architecture had served him. He had made decisions under pressure that other people couldn't make. He had stayed steady in situations that required steadiness. He had been reliable in every way that mattered professionally and in every way that mattered personally, and the places where those two categories overlapped, which was most places, he had been very, very reliable. Here was the thing about architecture. It was not the same as feeling. You could build a very efficient structure around an absence, and you could live in it comfortably enough, and you might not notice the absence until the day something arrived that couldn't fit inside the structure you'd made. She hadn't fit. From almost the beginning, she hadn't fit neatly into the category of professional relationship, not because she was unprofessional, quite the opposite, but because she had been, from the start, a person. Fully, specifically, inconveniently a person. She had left notes about depreciation tables. She had made the hardest weeks manageable through sheer competence and the occasional well-timed comment that made him almost smile. She had worn a dress she'd been saving and asked if she looked okay, and he had given her a word that meant nothing because the words that were actually forming in his mind were not words he'd prepared a use for. He had intervened with Daniel because he hadn't examined why he was doing it. He had filed it under professional judgment and moved on. He had been very practiced at that kind of filing. What was undoing him now, slowly and thoroughly and without any of his customary defenses working properly, was the discovery that she had been watching too, that she had come back in the same dress, on purpose, to see what he would do, that she had set the test and passed it along with him. He found this, once he had sat with it, to be one of the most clarifying things that had ever happened to him. Two people in the same room, both watching, both afraid, both doing what they'd always done with fear, and neither of those things being fine, and both of them knowing it, and the whole thing resolving into a Wednesday night, a hallway, a door opening. One evening in December, they were in his office late, going through the Q4 numbers. She was across the desk from him, reading something on her laptop, making occasional notes. He had been reading the same page for 11 minutes. Stop pretending to read that. She didn't look up. I am reading it. You've been on the same page for 11 minutes. I counted. He set it down. I might be distracted. By what? He looked across the desk at her. A long moment. You. She held his gaze. Something behind her eyes went full in a way that she let him see this time, without converting it into something smaller. That's the best thing you've ever said to me. That's a low bar. It's the truest thing. The bar doesn't matter if it's true. He looked at her for a moment. Then, with the deliberateness that was fundamental to how he did everything, and with something underneath it that was new, or rather that had always been there, and was finally above the surface. I want to get better at this. I am not going to do it perfectly. I haven't done it perfectly so far, but I want to get better, and I want to do it with you. She looked at him across the desk and all the things she'd been bracing against. The waiting for the floor to shift, the expectation of exit, the preemptive dismantling, went very quiet. Yeah. A pause. Okay. Okay? I said what I said. He almost smiled. Brief, barely there. She caught it. She always caught them. By the spring of 2024, the reporting structure at Bay Capital had been formally reorganized. Arabella moved laterally into a Director of Executive Operations role, a position created partly through necessity and partly because, as Woo Rim had noted to the board with characteristic understatement, She was running approximately 40% of the firm's operational infrastructure, and it made sense for the title to reflect the reality. She was 29. He was 36. They had been in each other's orbit for 2 years and honest with each other for 6 months. And the difference between those two timelines was, when she thought about it, both funny and entirely predictable. They did not announce anything. That was not their nature, either of them. They were not announcement people. The people who paid attention figured it out in their own time. Jonas first. Through whatever combination of observation and workplace intuition he'd always deployed. Camille through an extended text thread that Arabella eventually screenshotted and sent to her mother. Her mother through a Sunday call during which she had listened to Arabella talk for 20 minutes without once suggesting she was fine. Everyone else simply noticed that the particular quality of tension that had lived on the 42nd floor for 18 months had resolved into something different. The floor breathed differently. Nothing dramatic. Just a room that had been holding its breath for a long time, finally exhaling. On a Thursday in April, a clear Manhattan spring day, the city doing its brief, persuasive impression of somewhere forgiving, Arabella was at her desk when she heard his office door open. She didn't look up. She was finishing a report. He stopped beside her desk. She looked up. He was looking at her the way he had always looked at her, with the full, quiet attention he gave everything. Except now he wasn't organizing it into something professional or filing it under something manageable. He was just looking at her. That was the only difference. And it was everything. "Do you have plans tonight?" he asked. She tilted her head. Depends. I made a reservation." "What kind?" "The kind where we sit across from each other and you order what I already know you'll order and I order something you'll eat half of without asking." She laughed. "The real one. Unguarded. Full. The one that filled whatever room it was in." He watched it with the attention he'd always given it, but now without the effort of pretending he wasn't. That's very specific for a reservation. I like specificity." She looked at him. Then, "I look good, by the way, in case you were going to say fine." He held her gaze. When he spoke, it was without inflection. The way he stated facts, the way he read numbers off a document. Except this was not a number, and he was not reading it. "You look extraordinary. You have always looked extraordinary." She let it land. She did not convert it. She did not deflect it, or wrap it in a joke, or hold it at arm's length where it would be safe and small. She let it arrive where it was aimed, in the center of the part of her that had been braced for so long. The floor held 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock. She turned back to her work. He turned back to his office. The city went about its ordinary, indifferent business outside the windows, 42 floors below. Everything was the same. Nothing was... That, she had come to understand, was what it felt like when something real had finally taken root. Not the disappearance of the ordinary, but the discovery that the ordinary had always contained this, had always been quietly holding space for the moment when two people decided to stop pretending they didn't see each other. She smiled at her screen. He smiled at his wall. Neither of them mentioned it. They didn't have to.